Okay, welcome in everybody. We are going to kick off the session in a moment. So you have joined us on a very sunny and hot afternoon. So if you're feeling hot like we are, that is fantastic. You're here with us. We are hopefully going to make this a really helpful session for you. And we're going to be looking at the GCSE English Literature 2 exams that are coming up for you. Just to introduce ourselves, so my name's Laura Huggins. I am the head of English at Academy21. If it's your very first time with us, Academy21, it's great to have you joining us, and I hope you feel comfortable and you find this really helpful. Sarah Brown is one of I love the little smile and wave. Sarah Brown is one of our English teachers, Academy21. She's part of a fantastic team that we have, Academy21. And just to say as well, both of us have got lots of years of experience teaching GCSE English Literature and as well being examiners for literature for different exam boards. So we're hoping that what we're going to take you through today is going to be really helpful and is going to give you as well some support in the next few weeks. Okay, we're going to start, everybody. Now, I'm going to start with a polling question. Again, we're going to keep this private. There's a lot of things you're revising at the moment, I'm sure. And I just wonder, if you look at those 3 statements you've got there, which of those statements about the English literature exam are true and which are false? And you can have a quick click in the polling pods and click on which ones are true. Good question already come through in the Q&A pod. We're going to be talking about the AQA English Literature exam. However, there will be lots of common themes that link to other exam boards. So what you'll see in a moment, if you're coming from a different exam board that's not AQA, you will see that there are still going to be some really useful things in this session. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question. Right, let's see. What do you already know? So if we look at these answers, then everybody, here's the first one. So those first 2 statements were actually true. So we're going to look in a moment at what's going to be on your 2 exam papers. The final one is false. Now, you might be thinking, it'd be great if I could take in my text to the exam. I'll talk you through, I think, why that's not necessarily always the best thing to do, actually. But the exam doesn't allow you to take in text. So, as you'll see, there is one exception to that, which is the poetry anthology, where you'll have access to one of the poems. But that is important to remember as well. Okay, this is what we're going to kind of try and cover today. Sarah and I, when we were planning this and we were thinking about what do you need to know, what are kind of those top tips that you want now before you get to the exam, this is what we've come up with. Now, there's a lot we could cover. We are not going to try and cover all the content. So if you need to go and do some revision for Macbeth, or you need to do some revision for your poetry for the anthology, and you need to reread those texts, there are different resources you can use for that. What we're going to do today is make sure that we've got a real clarity about what's going to be on those 2 exam papers. Really understanding what those different exam questions are asking of you and what those assessment objectives are, and also providing you hopefully with some really good practical tips to inform your own independent revision work in the next few weeks. So I'm going to start by looking at paper 1 with you for the next few minutes, and then I'm going to pass back to Sarah, who's going to take you through paper 2. This is what paper 1 looks like, and I am showing you here an example of an AQA, but as you'll see, there are many similarities to other exam boards as well. So paper 1, we've got 2 sections. First section is Shakespeare. So you will have studied one of those plays that you can see there. In that section, you're going to be given one question. The question does have two parts to it. So one part is asking you to look at an extract and to comment on that, and then to think about that extract, the ideas or the character in the whole of the text. So that's the question you're going to get on section A, which we're going to look at in a moment. If you now take a look at section B, we've got the 19th century novel. So that it's the same amount of time, it's worth the same number of points and marks for you. And again, it's a very similar question. You've got two parts to that question, starting with an extract, and then secondly, looking at the whole of the text. So we're going to start by looking then at what that exam question will look like. So what I'm showing you on the screen now is an example of a Shakespeare question from section A. It is obviously, as you can see there, about Macbeth. If you are doing a different play, like Romeo and Juliet, your question will be worded in a very similar way to what we've got here. So it's the same format. If you take a look at that question, the first thing I always say to students is to look closely at those two bullet points. Those two bullet points in the question tell you that there are two things that you need to be doing in your answer. The first thing you need to be doing is looking at the extract that you have been provided by the examiner in that exam paper. So this one we're going to look at in a moment. We've got an extract here from Act 1, Scene 5. It's Lady Macbeth's soliloquy. And the first bullet point is asking you to look just at that extract, to analyse Shakespeare's use of language, the form, the structure, the dramatic devices that are being used in that passage. So that's the first point. And I often find that students are usually okay with that bit. There is, however, a second part to the question. And this part of the question is asking you to think now about this as the play as a whole or the text as a whole. So how does Shakespeare present ambition in the play as a whole? And what you've been asked to do there is think about the rest of the play. So not just the extract, but the rest of the play. And again, I'm going to give you some top tips later on about how you can do that. So you might think about some of the events that also link to that big idea. You might want to think about other characters. You might want to think about other important scenes. But you need to make sure that when you are answering this question, you are covering both of those bullet points. Right. We're going to have a look. Hopefully, I say this resource will be really useful for you. If you have just arrived with us in the room, it's great to have you with us. All of these resources that we're sharing with you today, you can download from the file pod on the right hand side. Please do and use those as well for you for your work later. So a checklist. Now, if you are looking at an extract then, you don't know what that extract is going to be, but there are certain things you could be looking for. And here is a bit of a checklist for you. So firstly, you're expected to look at the language. Are there any particular words that stand out that are particularly significant? Think about the connotations of those words. Are there any literary devices that you're noticing in that extract, like a simile, a metaphor, sound techniques? Remember that when the writer is using those techniques, they are not just mere decoration. They are there for a reason, and they are always there to give us interpretation of character or the scene and the mood. The other thing to look for is tone. So if you get that extract, is there any shift in the tone? Does it change? So it might be that there's moments which are very serious and tragic. Is there an example of irony in there? Is there a moment of comedy? So look out for that as well. I often find students find the next part probably hardest, which is thinking about the structure, the form of the extract. So again, good points to look for here. Look for the rhythm of the lines. Is there any change in the rhythm that you can see? So we know that Shakespeare writes often, predominantly in iambic pentameters. If we see a change in that, if we've got these shorter lines, for example, if the rhythm changes, there's got to be a reason. So look out for that. Look for punctuation. So if you're seeing that maybe speech is broken up, it's quite fragmented, that's important. It can tell us about how the character's feeling at that point. So does the speech flow? Is it fragmented? What might you be noticing there? And the final one, and I think again this is important to remember, this when we look in the Shakespeare question, it is a dramatic device. So you do need to think about the way it's being performed. So we've got stage directions to look at maybe. We can look at things like dramatic irony, foreshadowing. Um, we might have a soliloquy from a character. What is that revealing about the character and how they're feeling at that point in the play? So this is a really useful checklist. You don't need to obviously make notes on that at the moment. You can find all of that in the file pod. Do download it and have a look at that in your own time as well. I want to just give you a really quick example, and it is quick, so please do take your time using the notes in the file pod. Um, if we were looking at this passage, what kinds of things might we spot? So here we've got this soliloquy from Lady Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5. If you've been doing your revision, you may well recognise this one. If we were looking at language, these are some of the things we might spot. So have a quick look at what you might have noticed there. I'm going to answer questions that just come through. A soliloquy is when a character is giving a speech um, to themselves, to the audience, and they're describing how they're feeling. So it's that moment when the audience is getting a real insight into how the character is feeling. So here we've got Lady Macbeth. We can see that she is already ambitious. She wants Macbeth to act and become King of Scotland, doesn't she? So picking up the language, you might have spotted some of those we've got there. You might spot some structural techniques there. Okay, there's a few examples for you to take a look at. And we've also got some dramatic devices there. Now, I went through that really quickly. Don't worry if you didn't get all of that. It is in the file pod. Okay. Thank you very much for those of you giving questions in the Q&A pod. Thank you for the team who are also answering that behind the scenes. Thank you very much, Patricia, for doing that. Okay, I've just looked at my time. I'm going to move it on, everybody. So let's look at a few other things. A quick look at this. Again, you can see this in the file pod. The second part of that question, remember, is looking at the whole text. What do you need to think about? And I use these categories when I do this with my students. So think about other events in the play that link to the question. Think about characters that link to the question. Think about any other big themes and big ideas that may be linked to that. Always remember the context, which I'll come to in a second as well, and then think about what is the writer's intention there. There is also a very good, I hope, resource. Again, it's there in the file pod for you, which you can use. So if you want to have a go, do a bit of independent revision work on this, take that, see if you can have a go at thinking about the second part of that question. If you are here today and you're not doing Macbeth, maybe you can replace it with a different question for your text that you're doing. And I'm sure if you searched online, you'd be able to find some of those past papers, exam papers as well. Okay. Okay. Last few points from me. Context. Now, you will probably know because your teachers have been telling you this all the way through the course. Context is really important. It is really important that you know when the text was written and also how that affects the actual text. So what the text is about, or the ideas in the text, or the way that we might react to that text. So there's a few examples there for you. I'm going to give you just a quick few. It says there, context. Think about maybe different reader responses. If you are thinking back to Shakespeare's plays, okay, think about how that original Jacobean audience would have responded to the play and how it might be very different to us now in the 21st century. Okay, so that's to do with context. Think about what's happening at the time in which the text is set. So, what do people believe? What are their attitudes, their values, and how does that come through in the text that you're reading? Think about the writer. You know, what's their personal experience? How does that again influence what they are writing about? If there's one thing I'm going to say take from today, don't forget your context. So it's really important that you have context in your answers in the exam. It does make a difference in your final grade. So if you haven't thought about the context before, that is something for you to definitely look at. I think I'm going to do right, it's a quick point, and they've got 1 point from me. I'm going to pass over to you, Sarah. I might be just about on time. So this is an example of the second question on paper one. If you remember back to what we've already said, paper one, we have got um, the Shakespeare, and we have got the Christmas. Oh, well, in this case, a Christmas Carol, your 19th century text. Just to say that the way that this question is written is exactly the same as what you just saw with the Shakespeare. So once again, you are starting from an extract. So you have an extract to look at. So take that checklist, apply it in the same way as we did for the Shakespeare. The second bullet point, you then need to think about that idea in terms of the rest of the novel. Okay, so it looks exactly the same. Right, one last slide from me, and then I'm going to get Sarah to come back. Hopefully, Sarah is still there. So last thing, quotations. Now, I'm looking down the Q&A pod. I'm thinking, is anyone asking this question already? Yes, I can see it coming through. Right, quotations. How do we use quotations in the exam if we can't take the books and the text in with us? Now, your teachers will say to you, you do need to add in quotations, or you do need to have references in there. Sometimes students get really upset, kind of really anxious about that, and try and learn really long quotations. That is not what the examiner is looking for. What you need to be thinking about is those very short quotations that you can use in different ways. So take a bit of time to think about the quotations you're going to actually learn and how you can use them in different ways. And this is just an example, comes from the same scene actually, scene one. Act one, scene five. And this is Lady Macbeth. She says to Macbeth, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." Now, I don't have to remember that exactly word for word. I might just remember innocent flower, or that she wants him to be the serpent. That's absolutely fine if you're just remembering those little words. They are still references. So if you look at that, you might see, well, that's a good quotation to use. It gives me some ideas about the writer's methods that I can comment on. It's also a quotation that tells me about some of the big themes. So let's say I got a question about the theme of ambition. Perfect. I could use that quotation. And it's also a quotation that links into things like context. So when you're thinking about your quotations that you are going to learn, keep them short and make sure that they're ones you can use in different ways as well. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Sarah. So you're going to have a change of voice, which is probably good at this point, and then I'll come back in a bit.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking you through paper 2, and you can see an overview of the paper here. So as you can see, for paper 2, it is a slightly longer exam than paper 1. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes long. And you can see there are 3 sections here, but you actually write 4 essays for this exam, as the section C unseen poetry has 2 essays that you need to write for it. So section A is your modern text, and depending on the text that you have been taught, this will either be a prose text or a play. Section B is your poetry anthology, and you will be given one named poem in the question, and then you choose a second poem from the anthology you've studied to compare that to. And then section C is that tricky unseen poetry component. So like I said, you have 2 questions here. The first one will give you one unseen poem, which you then answer a question on. And the second question gives you a second unseen poem, which you then compare with the first one. So in terms of your timing with the section C, you would spend about 30 to 35 minutes on the first section, and then about 10 minutes, or at least 10 minutes, on the second part of the unseen poetry question. So I'm going to start off looking at the section A then, which is your modern text. So for section A of paper 2, you will be given a choice between 2 different questions. For your paper 1, you don't get that choice, but here you do, but you only need to answer one. Another difference to paper 1 is that there will be no extracts provided for this question, so no extracts are given to you in the exam. Often, but not always, one of the question will likely focus on character and the other on theme, but either way, remember that those are interchangeable. So what I mean by that is, let's take the text in Inspector Calls. If you are given a question on responsibility, you could answer that by using characters. So you could choose 3 characters to focus on who show us something about that theme. So perhaps for responsibility, you could have one paragraph where you look at Mr. and Mrs. Burling and their refusal to accept any responsibility. Then a second paragraph on Eric or Sheila and how the younger generation are able to accept what they've done. And then maybe a final paragraph on the inspector and his didactic role in trying to facilitate everyone's understanding of responsibility. And that works exactly the same way around for the character question. So let's say you have a question on Sheila. You could answer that thematically by thinking about 3 themes that she is involved in. Let's say responsibility, being a member of the younger generation, and gender roles, and answer it in that way. Ultimately, for this first section, it's really important to remember that you are being assessed on all of the assessment objectives. And the examiners are essentially really looking to see that you understand the type of text you are writing about, so whether that's a play or a prose text, and that you understand the key themes and messages that the writers are trying to make. Okay, so moving over into section B, this is the poetry anthology section. So you will have studied one of 3 possible poetry clusters. So when you're in the exam, make sure you turn to the right poetry section. This section also looks at all of the assessment objectives apart from assessment objective 4. So assessment objective 4 is a spelling, punctuation, and grammar AO, and that is only assessed in the section A of both of your papers, and it's only worth 4 marks in each paper. So for this question, you will be given a copy of the poem that is mentioned in the question you're given. So here for this example question, you would be given a copy of the poem My Last Duchess in your exam. You will not get any of the others. So one of the challenges with this question is ensuring that the poem you choose to compare the named poem in the question with really works well. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. You do also need to bring in context, and as Laura mentioned, context is very important, but the exam board does stress that AO3 is really about understanding reader responses, just as much as bringing in biographical information or comments on time period as well. So here are a couple of just top tips for preparing for this section of the exam. So first of all, make sure you are familiar with key poetic terminology. Make sure you're also clear on some of the key techniques that are used in each of the poems in your cluster, as well as key contextual points about them. Identify themes and ideas that connect the poems and practice pairing them as well. Write practice essays or paragraphs, even just doing some practice paragraphs every now and then, that's really beneficial. And trying to learn just a couple of key quotations from each poem as well. So, as I mentioned, it is really important to make sure that you are choosing a good poem to compare the named one with. You can revise that beforehand, like I mentioned on that previous slide, by grouping the poems together. So, we're just going to have a go at practicing that now. So, let's imagine that you have a question in the exam and it's on the extract from the Prelude. Which of the poems in the poll that Laura has kindly just dragged over for me, which of the poems do you think would work well with the Prelude if we had a question about the power of nature? So the power of nature and Prelude. I do appreciate as well, not everyone will have studied this specific cluster, so I do appreciate if you haven't read these poems, that's quite tricky. Okay, amazing responses so far, everyone. Thank you. That's absolutely fantastic. There are 2 clear winners coming out in that poll, which is brilliant because they're the 2 I'm going to talk about. So do feel free to keep answering that poll. So the Prelude is all about the power of nature and also about how our feelings and perceptions can impact our sense of reality. So in the Prelude, we have a journey through nature, and it shows the allegorical development of the narrator. At first, everything is brilliant, nature's peaceful, it's calm, he's having a lovely time. But then he steals that boat, and by doing that, the mountain in the distance seems to become large and terrifying and almost, stalks after him. His guilt has impacted his view of nature here and ultimately distorted it into something that becomes very threatening to him. So that shows his inner conflict and also the power of nature and the power of imagination too. In Exposure, and well done, lots of you voted for this in the poll. In Exposure, Owen shows how conflict exists not just within the war that the soldier is fighting in, but also those brutal weather conditions surrounding him, and nature in the poem is personified as another army attacking. And Storm on the Island, really well done again on the poll. This also shows mankind in conflict with nature. It shows us that man-made structure being battered by the storm, and that conflict that can happen between people and nature, and is, of course, a wider metaphor for the Troubles. So any of those poems would connect well, but in slightly different ways. So as part of your revision, we'd recommend listing the key themes, and you can see an example here for the power and conflict cluster. So listing the key themes that are shown across the anthology you have studied, and consider poems that would work best with each of them. It's also important to note that, don't be afraid to choose 2 poems that share a theme but show differences within that. So, for example, inner conflict versus external conflict. Right, so I'm just going to talk briefly about introduction. So one of the questions that often comes up is, do you need one? Now, the exam board does comment on the importance of an introduction, but it does not need to be long at all. Just a couple of lines is absolutely fine. For the ingredients of a good introduction, you do want to make it clear what your main arguments are going to be and how they link to the questions. And for the poetry sections in particular, so that's B and C of this paper, you want to provide a very, very brief overview of those poems to show that you understand them. So I'm going to show you an example one. So let's imagine we've got this question here on compare how the poets explore ideas of power and pride in My Last Duchess, and we're going to compare it to the poem Ozymandias. So this would be an example introduction here. I'm going to read it very quickly. Both Ozymandias and My Last Duchess show the damaging effects of power and pride. In the poem Ozymandias, Shelley shows us that pride is not lasting and ultimately that the power of nature is stronger. In My Last Duchess, Browning demonstrates how power can corrupt individuals and lead them to commit terrible actions. So here you can see you've got a clear comparative focus signposted through the use of the word both. There's a very, very brief summary of both poems and an introduction to some of the key ideas that will be expanded on in that essay. And in terms of how you might structure this is a very there's a possible way of doing it. I do want to stress that sections B and question 2 of section C ask you to compare. There is no set way of comparing. AQA stress this, as do the other exam boards as well. You can compare in the same paragraph or in different paragraphs. It doesn't really matter, but the best answers use comparisons to strengthen interpretations of the text and show your overall understanding. So here's a possible structure. This is, of course, putting all your ideas into one comparative structure, or you can split it, and I'm just going to pop a box there around where you would split it if you did want it in 2 paragraphs. So you do want to start with a clear comparative opening. Beginning with the word both is a really nice way of doing that, really signals to your examiner that you are comparing. Then hone into your first poem, provide your quotations and analysis, and then, either in the same or a different paragraph, bring in the second text, your quotations, your analysis, and then link back to the question. So there is an example paragraph here. This is a top band model paragraph. I'm not going to read through it because I'm conscious of the time, but it is in that PDF in the file section over there if you do want to download it. And you can see those sort of building blocks there as well. Okay, and finally, section C. So the unseen poetry section naturally causes quite a lot of anxiety because it's the unnerving nature of the unknown. You don't know what poems the examiners will have chosen for you. So one tip for answering this section comes from examiner reports, which mention that the questions here have been carefully written to help you understand the main themes of the poem. So straight away, the question attached to each of those unseen poems gives you a bit of an overview of what that poem is about. So read the questions carefully before you read the poems, and that should help your overall understanding of them, but also help you to think about what you want to sort of hone into when you answer that question. Top responses will create a conceptualized response. What that means is that you have a clear line of argument about the poem and what the poets are trying to convey. So every question in your literature paper assesses analysis, AO2. And just a note, when commenting on this, you really want to sort of think about the effects created. The effects are the important bit. So questions like, how do we feel as readers? What emotions do I have? Why do I have those emotions? What do I now understand as I've read this next line that I didn't know before? What ideas have been presented to me and where? And so on. One of the best ways to tackle the unseen poetry questions is by charting through the poems chronologically. So consider what you learn at each point as you're reading through the poem. Really importantly, just to say, you own your interpretations of the text. So your responses are valid. What you need to do is just justify them by explaining how and why you have your viewpoint and how and why the effects you say are created are created. And to finish from me, just a note on leveled responses. So the exam board often states that level 4 to 6, so the higher responses, move from sort of being outside of the text to inside. So they show awareness that a text is a construct, it's a creation by the author. Simple lower level responses sometimes slip into a recount of the events. What I mean by that is they kind of just tell the story of what happens in that text. Clear responses, so moving up the levels, start to show signs of analysis and consideration of the effects created. And those high level, thoughtful, perceptive responses have more focus on authorial intention as a way to develop ideas and arguments. So there's a clear consideration on how and why things have been done or included. So you can see some sentence stems here on the slide showing the different styles that are typically shown for each of those skills. But again, that is in the PDF, so feel free to download that and you can spend more time looking at these. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Laura now, so we can have some time on any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Right, you have been busy thinking about all of this, I can see. Can I give a big shout out to Patricia, who has been busily answering all your Q&A questions, and I hope you found that really helpful because there's been a lot coming through. We've got a few minutes left. I'm just going to pick up a few that we haven't answered in the Q&A. So one question that I've seen a couple of people ask is, which poems from the poetry anthology should I then revise? Now, you don't probably want to hear my answer to that one. My answer is all of them, because as Sarah was explaining, one of those poems will be chosen and you will have to answer on that poem. Okay, you don't know which one of the 15 poems it's going to be. Now, you might have poems that you have a preference, that poems that you particularly enjoy. That is completely natural. I have my preferences on those poetry anthologies as well. But do make sure you do look at all of those poems. The good thing about the anthology question is that the examiner is giving you a question which is open. So Sarah took you through some of those different themes. There is not just one poem that's going to fit that theme. There are lots for you to choose from, and you may well then be able to choose your favourite one. But please don't just revise a small few number of poems and then find in the exam that the one you didn't revise is on there. So just be careful with that as well. I think there's one final question that I'm going to pick up. And Sarah, if you want to jump in as well, you can do. And question I'm going to pick up on is, how do you manage your time in the exam? Because you're probably thinking, those two papers look really crammed. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot to cover. Right, I'm going to give one top tip, which is a really simple one. Make sure you can see a clock. Make sure you can actually see what the time is. You might remember back to like paper one. I said to you there's two sections. You're supposed to be spending equal amount of time on each of those. There is often a desire to kind of spend longer on the one you like and not the other one. Try and be quite firm on yourself on moving on when you need to, so that you've got time to balance those two questions. Sarah, is there anything else you would like to say about that?
Not necessarily on the timing, but there was one question on the comparison. And it's worth just noting, when you're comparing the poetry and also the unseen poems, try to have a 50-50 balance. The examiners know they've given you one of the poems. And what happens quite often is, because you have one there, more of your answer tends to focus on that one because you've got the quotations available. Try to avoid doing that. 50-50 balance where possible. Yeah.
No, good advice. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, a few things as we kind of finish off. Right, let me make sure I've reminded you of a few things. Don't forget before you leave to download, if you haven't done this already, from the file pod. First of all of those resources we just shared with you, take it with you. We've also got an attendance certificate, so thank you very much for coming today. Please do download that. Print it off, congratulate yourself on again another good step in your revision. It's a tough time at the moment, so really great to see you with us today. And also, we do have other sessions coming up. And I can see that some of you were in our session as well earlier this week, looking at preparing for exams. If you are curious about any other subjects, please do check them out. I'm going to put that up on the board in a second, but you can also download it from the file pod. No one's asked the question when the exams, but this is when your 2 exam English literature grade exams are. And as well, we want to wish you all the best. So I'm just going to pop up the poster to the revision session. I'll give you a chance if you want to say anything in the Q&A pod. If you want to give us a reaction, you can do in a second. And thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Don't forget to grab everything you want from the file pod before you leave. This is our schedule. Do come along to anything else as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening and enjoy your bank holiday weekend as well.